There existed upon this earth a nation so powerful that the ground itself trembled beneath the weight of their footsteps as they walked. They carved palaces from mountains, raised towers that pierced the clouds, and laughed at every warning Allah sent them through the years. No force on earth had ever broken them, no army had ever shaken their walls, no drought had ever truly humbled their arrogant and rebellious hearts. Then a single voice rose in the scorching desert heat and said, "You are worshipping stone, while your Creator is watching every breath you take." They answered back, "Who can destroy us? For who is stronger than us in all the lands that stretch beneath this wide and open sky?" But what Allah sent them next was not an army, not a flood, not fire. And what happened on that 8th morning shattered everything they believed. Before we start, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments below. If you already done, let's begin the journey. Long before the sands of Arabia learned the name of Muhammad, another nation ruled those ancient burning lands with terrifying power. They were called the People of Aad, and their story is preserved forever inside the eternal and unchanging words of Allah's holy book. Allah mentioned them in the Quran not once, not twice, but across multiple surahs as a warning for every generation that followed. They descended from the blessed lineage of Nuh alayhi salam, inheriting a world that had been cleansed by the great and devastating flood. After the floodwaters receded and the earth began again, the children of Nuh spread across the lands and built new civilizations in forgotten places. The people of Aad settled in a region called Al-Ahqaf, a vast and windswept land of curved and towering sand dunes in southern Arabia. This was a land of extreme heat, endless dunes, and open skies stretching far beyond what any human eye could ever fully see. But despite the harshness of that desert world, the people of Aad did not suffer, because Allah had blessed them beyond imagination and measure. Allah gave them bodies unlike any other people walking the face of this earth during that ancient and powerful era of early human civilization. They were described in Surah Al-Fajr as the people of Iram, the city of lofty pillars, unmatched across all surrounding lands and distant nations. Their physical strength was extraordinary, their frames towered above ordinary men, and their hands could shape stone the way a craftsman shapes soft clay. They carved their homes directly into mountains, built monuments that rose toward the heavens, and constructed cities that made traveling merchants stop in silent awe. No neighboring tribe dared to challenge them, no foreign army dared cross into their territory, and no force of nature had yet humbled their hearts. Allah had opened the skies above them with abundant rain, blessed their valleys with flowing water, and given them children, wealth, and magnificent overflowing gardens. In Surah Hud, Allah reminds them of exactly these blessings, telling them through His messenger of every precious favor and gift they had freely received. He had made them successors after the people of Nuh, increased them greatly in power, and established them firmly upon the earth beneath their feet. But a terrible sickness had grown silently inside the hearts of Ad, spreading like poison through the roots of a once great and towering tree. That sickness had one name, and that name was arrogance, and it had wrapped itself so tightly around their hearts that no truth could enter. Because of their strength, they began to believe they were untouchable, and because of their towers, they believed no consequence could ever reach them. They turned away from the worship of the one who had given them everything and bowed instead before idols carved from the very stone their hands shaped. Their idols had names, lifeless statues of rock that could not hear a single prayer, could not grant a single wish, and could not blink. Yet the people of Ad, prostrated before these stones with full devotion, offered them sacrifices and built their entire spiritual world around powerless and hollow things. And with their worship of idols came oppression, because when a people stop fearing Allah, they begin crushing the weak ones who cannot defend themselves. The powerful among Ad crushed the powerless. The wealthy hoarded what Allah had given freely, and justice became a word no longer spoken among them. They boasted of their monuments to every visitor who passed through, boasted of their armies, and boasted with a pride that had no lasting foundation. Allah, the most merciful and the most just, did not abandon these people to their destruction without first sending them a guide and a clear warner. His name was Hud alayhi salam, and he was not a stranger sent from distant lands, but a man born and raised among Ad himself. He was one of them in blood, one of them in language, one of them in tribal lineage, yet his heart carried something theirs had lost. He carried the light of Tawheed, the absolute and uncompromising belief that there is no God worthy of worship except Allah, the creator of all existence. When Allah chose him and sent revelation upon him, Hud alayhi salam stood up among his people with courage, clarity, and a message that rang like thunder. He called them to the worship of Allah alone, reminded them of the favors they had received, and warned them of a punishment beyond their imagination. His voice reached across the marketplaces of Ad, into the grand halls of their leaders, and into the ears of every man and child among them. He spoke to them with wisdom. He spoke to them with sincerity, and he spoke with the genuine love of a man trying to save his people. He reminded them that these idols had never created a single grain of sand, had never sent a single drop of rain upon their thirsty earth. He told them to seek forgiveness from their Lord, to return to the straight path, and to remember that all their power came from Allah alone. But the leaders of Ad looked at this man who dared challenge everything their world was built upon, and their response was immediate and burning contempt. They looked at him and saw not a prophet of Allah, but a threat to their power and a direct insult to their ancient and inherited pride. The rich among them mocked him openly in the public squares, and the tribal elders turned their backs on him in the great gathering places of their cities. And yet Hud alayhi salam stood firm, returned to them day after day, year after year, never abandoning his mission no matter how fierce the rejection grew. What happened next between this lone and patient prophet and an entire civilization of giants is a story that will shake everything you believe about power and its end. The years passed slowly over the burning land of Al-Ahqaf, and still the people of Ad refused every word Hud alayhi salam delivered to them. The chiefs of Ad gathered in their grand halls and plotted carefully against the message that Hud alayhi salam carried faithfully among his own people. They did not simply ignore him the way one ignores a passing wind, but worked actively to silence and destroy his growing influence among the people. His message had never changed, his conviction had never weakened, and his sincere and steady eyes still made the most arrogant chiefs deeply and visibly uncomfortable. The leaders spread deliberate lies across every marketplace, every tribal gathering, and every public space where ordinary men and women came together to meet. They announced publicly that Hud alayhi salam had lost his mind and that some strange and terrible madness had completely overtaken his thinking and his speech. They said their ancestors had always worshipped these idols and that their fathers before them had found absolutely no fault in the gods of beautifully carved stone. This argument was not born from reason or from evidence, but from comfort, from tradition, and from a deep and paralyzing fear of necessary and uncomfortable change. Hud alayhi salam answered them with remarkable patience, reminding them that blindly following forefathers into error is simply the quiet inheritance of destruction passed through careless generations. He told them that Allah, who had shaped them from the dust of the earth, was infinitely greater than any idol their own weak hands ever formed. He reminded them again and again that the rain feeding their gardens and the strength filling their enormous bodies came only and entirely from Allah alone. He warned them with words recorded forever in Surah Hud that Allah could replace them with another people if they continued turning arrogantly away from the truth. This warning was not born from any weakness, but from the calm and certain conviction of a man who carried the full weight of divine truth. The chiefs then decided to deploy a different weapon, one they believed would completely and permanently destroy the credibility of Hud alayhi salam among the listening people. They called him a fool, they called him deluded, and they used the sharpest and most cutting words their arrogant tongues could possibly produce against him. They argued openly that his God was invisible, without a statue, without any physical form that devoted and desperately searching human hands could ever reach or touch. This was the twisted logic of a people who had deeply confused the creation with the Creator and allowed their eyes to replace their spiritually starving hearts completely. Yet despite all this organized ridicule and opposition, something remarkable and powerful was quietly happening among the ordinary and humble people of Ad beneath the noise. Some among the common people began genuinely listening, feeling the undeniable truth that was carried within his steady and deeply sincere and unwavering daily words among them. These were the ones who had witnessed the injustice of the powerful and felt the crushing cruelty of the tribal leaders pressing down hard upon their lives. These ordinary souls had long sensed that their stone idols offered absolutely nothing real or meaningful during their deepest and most desperate and painful moments of need. But the chiefs watched this quiet movement very carefully and moved swiftly to crush any emerging belief before it could spread beyond their iron tribal control. They threatened every person who showed genuine interest in the message and used their tribal authority to pressure entire families into absolute and suffocating social conformity. The great civilization of Ad was an enormous outward power that was rotting completely and catastrophically from deep within its own hollow and spiritually bankrupt core. Then Allah, in His perfect and infinite wisdom, began sending them clear signs, not yet the final punishment, but warnings written plainly in the language of nature itself. The rain that had always so abundantly blessed their lands began to slow and thin, pulling back quietly like a tide retreating from a long, familiar shore. Their magnificent gardens began drying slowly at the edges, their rivers grew dangerously narrow, and a creeping unease settled across Ad like the shadow of an approaching storm. Any people possessing true wisdom would have paused, reflected deeply, and sincerely asked themselves whether the persistent warnings of this one patient man carried real, divine truth. But the people of Ad did not pause, did not reflect, and instead pressed harder against their useless stone idols, demanding the relief that those idols never gave. The chiefs then dispatched a delegation to a distant sacred sanctuary, sending their most prominent men with gifts to seek rain for their slowly suffering and drying land. This delegation carried no genuine repentance inside their hearts, no sincere turning toward Allah, only the same deep arrogance now dressed in the clothing of hollow ritual performance. Allah allowed them their journey and allowed them to make their requests, because the divine plan for this stubbornly arrogant nation had not yet reached its final appointed moment. When the delegation returned, they brought back no rain, no promise of mercy, no divine relief of any kind, only the same hardness they had carried when leaving. Hud alayhi salam continued calling and warning every single day, standing entirely alone against a civilization that had chosen towers of carved stone over the living truth of Allah. He declared with absolute and unwavering clarity, preserved forever in the words of the Quran, that he sought no wealth, no status, and no earthly recognition from them. He told them his reward came only from Allah, the creator of the heavens and the vast earth, and that this alone was entirely sufficient for him. He stood every single day under that same ancient and burning Arabian sky, carrying a trust from Allah that no amount of rejection could ever break or weaken. But something was already moving with quiet and deliberate purpose far beyond the distant horizon of Al-Ahqaf, something that no chief, no idol, and no tower could ever stop. A dark cloud was forming slowly across the ancient Arabian sky, and what that cloud was carrying inside it would forever answer every question about who truly holds power. And when that cloud finally appeared above the land of Ad, everything that was about to unfold next would shake the foundations of the entire ancient world forever. The cloud appeared on the horizon of Al-Ahqaf like a massive dark curtain being slowly and deliberately drawn across the ancient and burning Arabian sky above them. It was unlike any cloud the people of Ad had ever seen rising over their land in all the generations they had proudly inhabited this ancient desert earth. It moved with a strange and unnatural purpose, rolling forward across the sky as though it was being driven by an invisible and unstoppable and all-powerful commanding force. When the people of Ad first saw it gathering on the distant horizon, a wave of excitement rippled through their cities and swept across their sun-baked and thirsty land. They had been suffering under a relentless drought. Their gardens were dying, their rivers had thinned, and every dry and cracked day had made them more desperate for rain. So when this enormous and towering dark cloud appeared moving toward them, the people rushed out of their homes and stood in the open air with arms raised in celebration. They believed with absolute certainty that Allah or their idols or the rituals of their delegation had finally delivered the rain their dying and desperate land so urgently needed. Allah preserved this precise and heartbreaking moment forever in Surah Al-Ahqaf, the 46th chapter of the Quran, in words that carry the weight of an eternal and devastating truth. They saw the cloud heading toward their valleys, and they said with joy that this was a cloud bringing them the rain they had been so desperately and eagerly awaiting. But what came next from the words of Allah was not confirmation of their joy. It was a correction so devastating that it has echoed across every century since that ancient day. Allah responded to their celebration with words that cut through their excitement like a blade through silence, words that revealed the true and terrifying nature of what was approaching them. Allah declared in Surah Al-Ahqaf that this was not a cloud of rain, but was instead a wind, carrying within it a most painful and annihilating divine punishment sent to them. It was the answer to what they had mockingly demanded from Hud alayhi salam, when they arrogantly told him to bring upon them the punishment he had so persistently warned about. The wind hit the land of Ad with a force and a fury that no human language has ever been fully able to capture or adequately describe to any listener. Allah described it in Surah Al-Haqqah as a furious and bitterly cold, howling wind that he unleashed against them continuously for 7 nights and 8 relentless and unending days. 7 nights and 8 days. That was not a storm that passes quickly in the darkness and leaves the earth wet and the people grateful for surviving what came through. 7 nights and 8 days of a wind so violent, so searingly powerful, that it picked up the bodies of the giant people of Ad and hurled them through the air. Allah described in Surah Al-Haqqah that the people of Ad were left looking like the hollow and fallen trunks of ancient uprooted palm trees scattered helplessly across the devastated earth. Those same bodies that had once made entire nations tremble with fear were now being tossed through the air like dried leaves in the grip of an unstoppable and merciless wind. Those same towers they had built to prove their greatness to every passing traveler and distant nation were crumbling into dust and rubble under the fury of what Allah had sent. Those same monuments they had pointed to with pride and arrogance, saying, "Who is stronger than us?" were being torn apart as though they had never been built at all. The wind destroyed everything by the command of its Lord, and Allah preserved this truth in Surah Al-Ahqaf, saying it destroyed everything by the permission and command of Allah alone. Nothing was left standing that the people of Ad had spent generations building with their enormous strength and their unshakable and arrogant belief in their own permanent and untouchable power. The marketplaces where they had mocked the Prophet of Allah were gone. The grand halls where the chiefs had plotted against his message were swept into the consuming and merciless dust. The idols they had prostrated before, the stone gods they had offered sacrifices to, the carved figures they had trusted over the living word of Allah were utterly and completely destroyed. And where was Hud alayhi salam during those 7 nights and 8 days of divine punishment descending upon the land and people he had spent years trying faithfully to save? Allah protected him and the small group of sincere believers who had accepted his message, sheltering them from the furious wind that was systematically dismantling everything around their trembling and grateful bodies. While the wind raged and roared across Al-Ahqaf, the believers stood in the protection of Allah, witnessing with their own eyes the absolute and undeniable power of the one they had chosen to worship. They had been mocked for their belief, threatened for their faith, pressured by the most powerful men in their civilization, and yet here they stood alive inside the mercy of Allah. And the chiefs who had gathered in their grand halls to plot against the message of Allah, where were they now in those 7 nights and 8 days of divine reckoning? They were powerless, completely and utterly stripped of every weapon they had used against the truth, every tower of pride reduced to nothing beneath the commanding wind of Allah. The man they had called a fool, the man they had accused of madness, the man they had threatened and mocked and dismissed stood firm while their entire world collapsed around him. This is the moment the Quran wants every human heart across every generation to pause and deeply feel, because this moment carries a truth that cannot be argued with or escaped. Power that is built upon arrogance, upon oppression, upon the rejection of Allah and the mistreatment of His messengers is never as permanent or as unshakable as it appears to be. Allah says in Surah Al-Dhariyat that He left from the people of Aad not a single soul remaining, not one survivor among those who had chosen arrogance over the truth of their Lord. The land of Al-Ahqaf, that had once thundered beneath the footsteps of the mightiest people on earth, had become a vast and silent and empty graveyard stretching across the ancient desert. The wind had completed what it was commanded to complete. It had fulfilled the divine decree with perfect and absolute precision, and then it was still, and the silence that followed was total. Where once there were cities, there was now only sand. Where once there were towers, there was now only dust. And where once there were giants, there was now only a devastating and eternal lesson. Hud alayhi salam looked out across the land where his people had once stood in all their power and pride, and what settled in his heart in that moment is beyond any words. But the story of what this destruction left behind, the lesson it burned into the soul of every nation that came after Aad, is what we must now turn to and fully understand. The wind had stopped, the sky had cleared, and the land of Al-Ahqaf lay before the eyes of the surviving believers in absolute and devastating and complete silence. What had been one of the mightiest civilizations ever to walk upon the face of this ancient earth was now nothing more than scattered ruins buried beneath the indifferent desert sand. The towers that had once pierced the clouds, the monuments that had made traveling merchants stop in silent awe, had all been reduced to rubble and forgotten dust in 8 days. 7 nights and 8 days was all that Allah required to completely dismantle what the people of Aad had spent countless generations building with their enormous strength and boundless arrogant pride. The believers who stood under the protection of Allah during those devastating days now stepped out into a world that looked nothing like the one they had known all their lives. They walked through what remained of the cities of Aad, past the ruins of the grand halls where chiefs had plotted, past the broken remains of the idols they had once feared. Those stone idols that had been offered sacrifices, that had been bowed before with devotion, that had been trusted over the living word of Allah, now lay shattered and utterly powerless in the dust. There was something deeply and profoundly moving about this sight, because these stones had never possessed a single grain of power, and now even their physical forms had been broken and scattered. The believers had been told this truth by Hud alayhi salam for years, and they had believed him. And now the earth itself had confirmed with absolute certainty every word he had spoken. Hud alayhi salam moved through the devastated land carrying in his chest the most complex and heavy mixture of emotions that any prophet of Allah has ever been required to bear. He had loved these people with a deep and genuine love. He had spent years of his life calling them back to Allah with patience, sincerity, and unwavering and tireless dedication. He had stood in their marketplaces and been mocked. He had entered their grand halls and been dismissed. He had warned them with tears in his heart, and they had laughed. And now they were gone. Every single one of the chiefs who had plotted against his message, every arrogant leader who had called him a fool, was gone from the face of the earth. This was not a moment of celebration for a true prophet of Allah. This was a moment of profound and heartbreaking grief, mixed with the certain knowledge that divine justice is always real. Allah does not punish a people until He has sent them a clear warner, and He had sent them Hud alayhi salam with years of patient and persistent and sincere warning before the end came. The destruction of Ad was not an act of divine cruelty, but an act of divine justice, the inevitable consequence of a people who had been given every blessing and chosen arrogance over gratitude. Allah says in Surah Hud that it was not Allah who wronged them, but it was they themselves who had wronged their own souls through their persistent and deliberate and arrogant rejection of truth. This verse carries within it one of the most important and sobering truths that any human heart can ever sit with, absorb, and allow to permanently change the way it sees the world. The consequences that fell upon Ad were consequences they had chosen for themselves through every act of arrogance, every rejection of the messenger, and every moment of cruelty toward the weak among them. The small community of believers who survived gathered around Hud alayhi salam in the silence of that devastated land, and the weight of what they had witnessed together was beyond any ordinary human words. They had seen with their own eyes what happens when an entire civilization chooses pride over truth, when a people prefer the comfort of inherited falsehood over the difficult and demanding path of genuine faith. These believers carried this witnessed truth inside their hearts for the rest of their lives, and the memory of what they had seen would shape every decision, every prayer, and every humble breath they took. The news of the destruction of Ad traveled across the ancient world like a fire spreading through dry grass, reaching distant tribes and faraway civilizations that had heard of the mighty people of Ad. Those distant nations who had once trembled at the mention of Ad, who had looked upon their towers with envy and their armies with fear, now heard that they had been completely and utterly erased. This news shook the foundations of how those distant nations understood power, because if Ad with all their strength and all their monuments could be erased in 8 days, then what protection did anyone truly have? The only protection, the only real and lasting security that any human being or any civilization has ever possessed, is the protection that comes from sincere submission and gratitude and obedience to Allah alone. This was the lesson that the destruction of Ad burned into the consciousness of the ancient world, a lesson so powerful that Allah chose to preserve it forever inside His final and eternal book. Allah preserved the story of Ad in the Quran not as a historical curiosity, but as a living and urgent and eternally relevant warning for every nation and every individual that would come after them. Surah Al-Fajr asks every reader directly and personally whether they have considered how their Lord dealt with Ad, with Iram of the lofty pillars, unmatched across all the surrounding lands and nations. This question in Surah Al-Fajr is not a question about ancient history. It is a question directed at every living heart, asking whether we have truly seen and understood and absorbed the lesson before us. The land of Al-Ahqaf itself became a silent and permanent testimony to the reality of divine power, a vast and empty space where the greatest civilization of its age had once proudly and loudly stood. Travelers who passed through that region in the generations after the destruction of Ad would look across those empty sands and feel something deep and unsettling and humbling move through their chests without warning. Because there is something about standing in a place where greatness once existed and was completely erased that forces even the most arrogant human heart to quietly and involuntarily confront its own fragility and impermanence. The people of Ad had believed their towers would outlast every generation, had believed their strength would protect them from every consequence, had believed that nothing in this world could bring them down to their knees. And yet 8 days was all it took. 8 days for Allah to demonstrate with absolute and undeniable clarity that every tower of human arrogance, no matter how high it reaches, will always come down. Hud alayhi salam continued his life after the destruction of his people, carrying forward the mission of Tawheed, living as a testimony to the truth that Allah always protects those who sincerely hold to Him. His story did not end with the wind, his story did not end with the ruins of Ad, because the lesson he carried and the truth he spoke was never meant only for his generation. The story of Hud alayhi salam and the people of Ad was always meant to travel through time, crossing every century, reaching every civilization, arriving finally at your own ears and your own searching heart today. And what this ancient and devastating story means for you, living in your own time, with your own towers of pride and your own silent idols of the modern world, is what must now be explored. The wind that destroyed Ad stopped blowing over the sands of Al-Ahqaf thousands of years ago, but its lesson has never once stopped speaking to the human heart. Allah did not preserve the story of Ad in His eternal book simply so that scholars could discuss it in their gatherings or students could memorize it for their examinations. He preserved it because every single generation that has walked upon this earth after Ad has carried within it the same dangerous seeds of arrogance that destroyed that ancient and mighty nation. The people of Ad were not destroyed because they were physically weak. They were destroyed because their hearts had become completely and catastrophically disconnected from the one who gave them everything they possessed. This is the first and most important lesson, that the story of Hud alayhi salam burns permanently and deeply into every heart that is willing to receive and truly absorb its truth. Strength without gratitude to Allah is not a blessing. It is a slow and invisible poison that quietly hollows out a civilization from within until nothing real remains inside it. The people of Ad looked at their towers, their bodies, their armies, and their abundance and asked with arrogance, who could possibly be stronger than them upon this wide earth? Allah answers this question in Surah Fussilat, reminding them that the one who created them was far stronger than anything they could ever build, possess, or proudly point toward with their enormous hands. This answer from Allah was not just for Ad. It is for every nation in every century that has ever looked at its own power and forgotten where that power originally and truly came from. We live today in an age of extraordinary human achievement, of towering buildings that scrape the clouds, of technologies that would have seemed like impossible miracles to every previous generation of humanity before us. And yet, with all of this achievement, with all of this accumulated human power and knowledge and capability, the same ancient question still echoes across the centuries and lands directly at our feet. Are we grateful? Are we humble? Are we using what Allah has given us in ways that please Him and serve His creation? Or are we building our own modern towers of arrogance? The second lesson carried within this story is about the courage and the patience of Hud alayhi salam, standing alone against an entire civilization that had the power to destroy him completely. He stood in those marketplaces of Ad day after day, year after year, carrying a truth that nobody wanted to hear, refusing to compromise a single word of what Allah had revealed to him. There are people in every generation who are called to stand for truth in the face of overwhelming social pressure, family opposition, tribal expectation, and the crushing weight of popular and comfortable opinion. The story of Hud alayhi salam is a direct and personal message to every one of those people, telling them that standing alone with Allah is never truly standing alone at all. He asked nothing from his people, sought no reward from them, no recognition, no position, no worldly compensation of any kind, because his eyes were fixed entirely and completely beyond this temporary world. This is the quality that separates those who truly carry the truth from those who merely speak about it when it is comfortable and safe and socially acceptable to do so. The third lesson this story delivers to every living heart is about the terrifying speed with which divine justice can arrive when a people have exhausted every chance Allah has generously and patiently given them. 7 nights and 8 days, that is all the time that passed between the appearance of that cloud on the horizon and the complete and total erasure of the mightiest nation on earth. We do not know how many chances we have remaining. We do not know how close or how far the appointed moment of divine accountability for our own choices and our own arrogance truly is. The people of Ad did not know that the cloud they celebrated with raised arms and joyful hearts was actually carrying inside it the answer to their own persistent and arrogant rejection of truth. They celebrated what was coming to destroy them because they had lost the ability to read the signs of Allah, lost the spiritual vision that only sincere faith and genuine humility can preserve and protect. When a heart becomes hardened through arrogance, through the rejection of truth, through persistent disobedience, it loses its ability to see reality clearly, and what it mistakes for a blessing can be the beginning of its end. The fourth and perhaps most personally urgent lesson of this story is about the idols we carry in our own hearts in this modern age we inhabit and navigate daily. The idols of Ad were made of stone and were easy to identify and point toward. But the idols of our age are far more subtle, far more sophisticated, and far more dangerous because of that. Our idols are our status, our social media presence, our wealth, our nationality, our tribal identity, anything we place above our sincere relationship with and our genuine submission to Allah in our daily lives. Hud alayhi salam did not come to his people with a complicated message. He came with the simplest and most ancient and most powerful truth that any prophet has ever carried to any people. He came saying, worship Allah alone, be grateful for what He has given you, treat the weak among you with justice, and do not let your blessings blind you to your complete dependence on your Lord. This message has not changed, it has not aged, it has not become irrelevant. It stands today as fresh and as urgently necessary as it stood in the burning and ancient land of Al-Ahqaf. Allah says in Surah Hud that in the stories of the prophets there is a firm strengthening for the heart of the believer, and every word of that promise is completely and absolutely true. The story of Hud alayhi salam does not belong only to the ancient past. It belongs to this moment, to this breath you are taking right now, as these words reach your ears and settle into your heart. Every tower we build without gratitude, every blessing we receive without humility, every warning we hear and dismiss with comfort and arrogance, brings us one step closer to the lesson that had learned too late. But we are still here, we are still breathing, we still have time that had no longer had, and that time is the most precious and most underestimated gift Allah has placed into our trembling and temporary hands. Hud alayhi salam called his people back to Allah with every breath he possessed, and the Quran calls us back to Allah with every verse we read, every story we hear, and every sign we witness around us. The wind of Al-Ahqaf carried away the towers, the monuments, the idols, and the arrogance of Ad, leaving behind only sand, silence, and a lesson that Allah ensured would never be lost or forgotten. That lesson has traveled across thousands of years of human history, crossed oceans and deserts and centuries, and it has arrived here at this precise moment, speaking directly and personally and urgently to you. The question that Surah Al-Fajr asks about how Allah dealt with Ad is not a question about the past. It is a question about what you will choose to do with the time you still have remaining. Will you build towers of arrogance or towers of gratitude? Will you chase the approval of people or the pleasure of Allah? Will you wait for the cloud, or will you turn back to your Lord today? The people of Ad are gone. Their towers are dust. Their idols are broken. Their names are remembered only as a warning, but your story, unlike theirs, has not yet been finally written or sealed.